Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the special joint City Council and Planning Commission study session of Tuesday, April 22nd, 2021. I now call the meeting to order, and if everybody could please rise, and I'm going to face the flag which is behind me, and let's do the Pledge of Allegiance together. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Mayor, if I could, it sounded like you said April 22nd, but I think you meant April 27th.
I thought I said 27th, but
people may have misheard you since I did, and I just want to make sure for the record.
It's possible. I read 27. I meant to say that. Anyway, but that's the date we have. So, City Clerk, will you please do the voice roll call?
Councilmember Chavez.
Present.
Councilmember Camaros.
Present.
Councilmember Harlan.
Here.
Councilmember Harper.
Here.
Councilmember Reynolds.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Mar.
Here. Here.
Mayor Stevens.
Here.
Commissioner Zick is absent. Commissioner Torje is absent. Commissioner Toller.
Here.
Commissioner Russell.
Here.
Commissioner Arith.
Present.
Vice Chair Colbert.
Present.
Chair D'Erico.
Present. And Ms. Green, Commissioner Torje will be joining us relatively shortly. She had a work commitment that's crossing over with this particular meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a presentation by our staff, and then we're going to have public comments. And I believe the public comments are going to be 2 minutes after that, correct?
Correct. 2 minutes for study sessions.
Okay, good. And we'll also have time for questions and comments by the planning commissioners and the city council. And if planning commissioners have questions, then Chair D'Erico is going to call on you, and I'm going to call on the city council, and we're going to get through this together. All right. So I think the next step is to call on who's going to make the presentation on behalf of staff.
Mayor, I'm happy to start.
That sounds great. Ms. Lee.
Thank you. Mayor and council members, it's my pleasure to present the study session this evening along with our staff and consultant team. This is our second study session regarding the housing element following our first study session just a few weeks ago. Last meeting, we focused on the community outreach as well as our community profile section of the housing element. This meeting will be focusing on the opportunities and constraints analysis, as well as identification of housing opportunity areas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Chen with Kimley Horn, who will give the presentation, and our staff team is here as well to answer any questions you may have after. Thank you. Mr. Chen.
Thank you, Jennifer. And good evening, members of council, members of planning commission. It's good to see you all again. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just let me know when you can all see it. Perfect, thank you. So as Jennifer mentioned, tonight we have a presentation on the city's 6th cycle housing element. Just to let you know, it's approximately half an hour to give you a little bit of a gauge. We will be covering a good amount of information, primarily around opportunities and constraints, the city's approach to sites analysis process so far, as well as a look into the housing programs, which are an important part of the housing element update process. So a little bit of our agenda tonight, we'll go through just a brief recap the housing element update process, look at opportunities and constraints, and then really dive into the city's 6th cycle sites analysis in terms of some of the areas we've looked at. We'll cover some outreach and what we heard and how that led to some of the areas that we'll be discussing tonight, as well as go over some residential density examples. I feel it's a good gauge to look at different housing development types and see what they potentially could look like, but also what planning for the future after this process may look like as well. Then cover a couple different sub areas that were analyzed, as well as look at accessory dwelling units and the role that plays in the housing element update process. We'll also look at some, just very briefly, into some potential housing programs that the city's looking at. It came out of the community profile research, and some are new requirements of state law. And then we'll look at next steps for the housing element update process. So a little recap on the housing element update. As we've covered previously, a couple major components of the housing element is the community profile, which was attached to the staff report. So if there are any questions or comments, we can provide those to staff and we can address those. An opportunity and constraints analysis, which we'll be touching on tonight. The goals, policies, and objectives, which is basically the programs or the actions the city will take to address housing issues that's identified throughout the rest of the document. An implementation program, which is how the city will implement those actions over the next 8 years, or whatever the specified timeline for each of those actions may be. And then also an appendices, a few things, a review of the city's fifth cycle, which looks at how the city performed during the fifth cycle, which comes to an end here at the end of the year. And then a summary of the community outreach that was conducted, and also the sites analysis, which is a topic of discussion for tonight. Also wanted to recap on the city's RHNA allocation or regional housing needs assessment allocation. The city was allocated 11,760 units spread across 4 income categories, being very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. As you can see, we have the income ranges for each of those income categories on the screen right now. And it's based on a median income of 103,000 for a family of 4. A little bit of context to those numbers. The city currently, on 2020 projections, were approximately 47% of the city's households fit within those extremely low, very low, or low income categories. So almost half of the community currently falls within the needs that we are discussing primarily tonight. A reminder that the housing element does address housing at all income levels, although the low and very low typically tend to steal the show sometimes. So looking at opportunities and constraints, we wanted to look at a few things. The housing element's required to analyze constraints, potential constraints that may pose some kind of impediment to housing development. It doesn't say that necessarily that it will. The city is just required to analyze those. They mainly fall into 2 categories, governmental and non-governmental. Governmental constraints are constraints that the city has some control or can affect. And those may be local regulations and processes, such as fees or project review periods. Could be development standards for particular zones and how those interact and how they actually tend to play a role in projects that come forward. And also could be local initiatives such as Measure Y. And we'll touch on Measure Y just a little bit more in a couple slides. And then there's potential non-governmental constraints. The city is still required to look at these constraints, even though there's not really a lot the city can do to address these. In Costa Mesa specifically, it's high land costs. And then just in California and kind of across the nation, it's high construction costs as well. And then protected land or unsuitable land. Obviously, not all land is available or even should be developed to residential or any other use. So the city has a minimal amount of land, which essentially acts as a resource to be able to meet the city's RHNA need. So the city also looks at opportunities and resources that could potentially lessen or remove some of these constraints. And some of the resources or opportunities the city is considering are an inclusionary housing ordinance, which the city is currently researching right now and is underway. That process is working in with the housing element to look at some of the assumptions we may be making. State density bonus laws, which we'll touch on in a little bit more detail in a couple slides as well, also provide the opportunity for housing to be built at affordable levels, as affordable component is required for different concessions under state density bonus. Streamlined application processing can help with project timelines, and a review of development standards can help make sure that as different housing products are developed and as developers come through with different innovative ideas, that those are able to be worked and addressed within the city's code. And lastly, housing programs, which we'll discuss at the end of the presentation. This is the city's main way of addressing some of these constraints. And again, these are the actions that the city will take based on the analysis done in the housing element update process to address some of these over the next 1 to 2 to 3, all the way up to 8 years, as the planning period is the next 8 years. So one potential constraint that we discussed previously was Measure Y. And this is largely because we heard throughout multiple community outreach events that it introduces risk into the housing development process and could discourage investment in the community. In mid-2020, the City Council voted to explore forming a citizen advisory committee to discuss Measure Y. Staff is currently working on this request, and we'll get back to council. And then I also mentioned we would discuss density bonus law. Recent changes to state density bonus law at the beginning of the year actually incentivize housing more, and so they do allow for density bonuses ranging from 35 to 50%, as assuming that certain affordability components are met on the base amount of units. So there's a big long spreadsheet about density bonus and all the different concessions that you could get and what the requirements for those are. But another important thing to note is that there haven't been any density bonus projects in Costa Mesa in recent years. So now we're going to go into the story of Costa Mesa's 6 cycle housing element sites analysis. We wanted to tell a quick story on this. So kind of a table of contents. We'll talk about the community outreach guidance. I think I'm fairly confident in saying pretty much every site that we've looked at, we've considered, every area we've considered can be traced back to some component of the community outreach process. And so I think that's key when we look at some of the considerations a little bit later on and some of the sub areas that we looked at. Whether that be, well, we'll go over it, but the town hall meetings or the district meetings or the survey, a number of different components gave community members the opportunity to look at those areas within the community. As I mentioned, we'll walk through density examples. Some are right here in Costa Mesa that we think give a good context for some of the densities that we'll be discussing, as well as some that are outside the community that we think represent good potential development. What's really important to remember is not necessarily architecture, but it's more the size and massing and that sort of thing, because the architecture is something that can be discussed at a later time as the city drafts some of these components to the programs. We'll do a sub-area walkthrough and the site strategy. We'll also look at accessory dwelling units and then potential programs. So relating to community feedback, I talked about a little bit that each, I think, almost every sub-area and most of the sites that we've looked at can be traced directly back to community comments. These came through community surveys, which we got, I believe, 400 some responses, if my memory is correct. District-specific meetings where we had maps for each district and community members, as well as many of the people who are on this call today, members of council and members of the Plan Commission, gave feedback and participated in the process by helping us to add notes or identify different areas or parcels that may represent opportunities for development. We also held subject matter expert meetings with home builders and developers, housing advocacy groups, and homeless service providers, and got a lot of really critical information and really good information from those meetings to be able to work into the sites analysis process. We also held focus meetings. Those have been over the last couple months with major property owners, affordable and market rate developers who have local experience developing in Costa Mesa and understand the context, understand what works locally and maybe what needs some consideration. We talked with Costa Mesa Affordable Housing Coalition, housing advocates, and also faith-based leaders in the community. And you'll see a little bit later as we talk about some of the sites, we're continuing those discussions as we continue to go forward. We're also planning to have additional follow-up meetings as basically the second round of analysis, sort of tied to either right before or during the public review draft release of the housing element document. We'll discuss timing on that towards the end of the presentation. So we wanted to walk through a few residential density examples. And as I mentioned, some of these are local to Costa Mesa. Some are around the community, around Southern California or California in general. We believe that these represent potential development scenarios, but also just a good range to kind of show that height and some of these other things are not always a good indicator of density. So we have some good information on the projects. And I believe it's kind of important to walk through these to understand what we're talking about a little bit later in each of the sub areas. So good reason to discuss density is the potential site strategies analyze housing at different densities. That's how we look at development in different areas. And it's one of the considerations for the sites analysis. Typically lower densities are your single family, either it's detached or attached. And as you get to higher densities, it goes towards your townhouses or apartments, more what we consider multifamily. And depending where in the city housing is planned, different densities may be appropriate for different areas. Some corridors may be better for higher densities and some may be better for lower. So we've taken that all into consideration in terms of our analysis and matching the community character. But we would love, obviously, here to get your feedback on that tonight as well. So wanted to bring a few examples of some mixed use because we did look at some areas where we looked at existing commercial centers and how we could revitalize these potentially, or commercial corridors. So wanted to show an example of a 38 dwelling unit per acre product that is a mixed use apartments combination for rent and for sale and some affordable. In this case, it's 4 stories, but it shows there's a first floor commercial and residential above it. Also wanted to show another mixed use as I'll let the cat out of the bag a little bit early. We have, based on community feedback, considered some additional housing along 17th as a potential opportunity area, although it's a fairly low number at the moment in terms of our assumption. But wanted to look at mixed use for that as well, as we considered something like this may be appropriate in an area like that or along Harbor or some of these other areas within the community. This happens to be 56 dwelling units an acre, but still 3 to 4 stories, stepping back in certain areas. And a good example of how, 60 to 70, that dwelling unit range doesn't need to be 5 or 6 stories or something. It can be done in 3 to 4, depending on the unit sizes, the character of the development, and all of these things which can be determined in the housing element programs as the city is implementing these programs over the next couple of years to really be able to have the time to dig into what those development standards look like and what the character and the visioning for these different areas looks like. I wanted to show Halcyon House, which is local at 81 dwelling units an acre. Again, 750 to 13 or almost 1,400 square feet unit plan sizes. So you can see there's a good range there. And this is 5 stories as well. Another 5 story is 580 Anton, also within the community. 125 dwelling units an acre, but again, may not be able to tell because, well, 7 stories, 5-story podium. Again, because of the development and the architecture and the context of it, while it is a fairly high density, higher than what we're making our assumptions on in the housing element, is a good example of where these developments are built within the community already. And then we wanted to show just a couple other quick examples. 60 dwelling unit per acre in Orange called Amley Uptown. A good product, all residential on almost a 5.5 acre site and 4 stories. And then for a little bit of variety, I wanted to also show more recent 55 plus or senior affordable apartments, 31.5 dwelling units per acre, and what's more traditionally a kind of a 3-story walk up. 3 stories, again, a lower parking ratio because of 55 affordable, but it is a fully affordable product. So pretty interesting to see as a good example. And then lastly, wanted to show a fully for sale product, just to show that kind of the development standards really do play a difference. So you can see the unit plan sizes here, because it's for sale, are a lot higher. And so overall at 4 stories, it's only at 24 dwelling units an acre. And there's 2 parking spaces per unit because I believe they do have garages. So it is just to show there's a really good variety of different types of developments. And it does depend on how the development standards are crafted for these different areas, all of which will occur as part of the housing element programs, not implemented at adoption of the housing element, but within a 3-year time period after the housing element adoption. So there's plenty of time to still discuss visioning and the character of these areas and how they come to develop to make sure the community character is taken into consideration. But we did want to show that we're considering that right now, and we'll continue that conversation going forward. A couple other just quick density examples of projects within Costa Mesa. I won't go through all of them, but they range from roughly a little bit over 30 dwelling units an acre to, again, 580 Anton, which was 125. I think this is just a good snapshot to show that there's a wide range of housing developments within Costa Mesa already. It may seem like there's a lot of single family houses, but Costa Mesa has a lot of mixed use already, and there are a lot of good examples out there of housing development, within the community. So next we'll go to a sub-area walkthrough and site strategy. And this is where we'll really kind of dig into the envelope of sites that we analyzed, what came forward sort of as the sites that we believe have a realistic development capacity, and then where we kind of go from this point. So the city will identify sites within each corridor or area identified. So essentially, the city did look at areas that residential was already considered previously, such as the urban plan areas, the city's overlays, and the specific plan, specifically North Costa Mesa specific plan. So wanted to analyze areas where housing was already considered to be a good idea and a potential housing location, and take that into consideration as part of the housing sites analysis. Understand the city does want to keep some of their commercial tax base, taking all the factors that we could into consideration. So the city looked at potentially revising or modifying densities within these areas, small boundary changes, but for the most part, these areas remain fairly similar to the way they exist now. So a couple strategies that we talk about in terms of the sites analysis strategies and things that we can consider, that the city can consider as part of this process. So amendments to the specific plans, urban plans, and overlays within the city. These are zoning changes that would occur. It's important to realize that the majority are urban plans and overlays, which sit on top of the base zoning. So it does not modify a parcel's base zoning, and essentially doesn't take away anything from their ability to develop what the parcel is zoned at. It's an added entitlement on top of it. Sorry, I'm going to back up real quick. A look at accessory dwelling units. Accessory dwelling units, since 2020, beginning of 2020, when new state laws came into play that really promoted the development of accessory dwelling units, we've seen an uptick in the community, well, really across Southern California, but Costa Mesa as well. And we'll go into a few of the numbers of that in a couple slides. But they play a huge part in the city sites analysis. So we talk about looking at corridors in different areas that are along major arterials. We also look at the existing neighborhoods, maybe not for multifamily development, but the role they may play for accessory dwelling units as we look to spread evenly and equitably distribute units throughout the community. And also identifying capacity maybe in areas that haven't been considered previously for housing, but because of recent development may benefit from some kind of synergy with housing developments in different areas. So we'll go over a few of those areas as well. It is important to remember as we go through this process, the concept of no net loss. So we want to just put a quick reminder. And it's essentially that the city, as part of the housing element process, needs to identify sites with the capacity to accommodate their full regional housing needs assessment allocation. And if at any point, well, I guess as the city develops over the next couple of years, over the planning period, that number comes down. Those units, essentially whatever income level they come in at, will be cut out of the city's need, and that will continue to drop. But if at any point sites develop in a manner that wasn't consistent with assumptions made in the housing element, as they are fully able to do, the city may need to look at potentially additional sites if they drop below the remaining RHNA need. So it's not to say it will happen, and a lot of it is based on the assumptions made in the housing element, but it is a consideration. And if it does happen, the city has 180 days to find additional capacity through other sites. There are a number of strategies to potentially address no net loss or try and address it up front, including making assumptions on the affordability of each site, and also looking to work with HCD on how to potentially address no net loss if it was to become a consideration. So this table may look a little familiar, although it is different. So we looked at, as part of the analysis, a number of different areas. And the next two slides are existing specific plans, urban plans, and overlays, and identified parcels within these that may be good potential development parcels. I believe as part of the staff report, there was a map provided as well of parcels that were being potentially considered. That is what we're considering the kind of the universe of sites. And then based on the assumptions of affordability, we will work down from there and essentially kind of cater down and see what potentially would be the best of the best to kind of float to the top to be part of the city's housing element. So those are the sites under consideration, but far from any sort of list of sites for the housing element. But we did look at, based on those, the potential kind of yield for these different areas if the parcels were selected that were considered. We looked at North Costa Mesa specific plan, had discussions with property owners and continuing to have those, and looked at the different densities. Many of the examples that provided in the density examples are from this area, and again go to up to 125 dwelling units an acre. And so you can see the considerations of 80 to 90 are a reasonable assumption. As we go down Newport Boulevard specific plan, Newport Boulevard specific plan, looking at raising the potential density of that area to 50 dwelling units an acre could get us, although the parcels are a little bit smaller and not a lot of them meet the minimum size requirements, between 900 and 950 if we were to look. And then going through Sobeca, the area remained the same, looked at potentially increasing the density in that area to 60, which could yield between 750 and 800 units. And then Fairview Developmental Center, we did make an assumption based on previous council initial very early discussions. And I think the range was somewhere in 1,500 to 2,500 as the potential yield for that site. Obviously, that site is needing of additional consideration. It came up multiple times during the community outreach process, almost in every community meeting that we had as a consideration for housing on that site, given that it is state-owned, that the city has to have additional discussions. And we looked at approximately 60 dwelling units an acre as a potential yield, again, in the early analysis part. So going over a few more, residential incentive overlay, we looked at potential parcels in here that could go up to 50 dwelling units an acre and between roughly a little bit over 1,000 units to 1,100. The Harvard Boulevard mixed use overlay, again, that 50 dwelling unit per acre range, going between 1,350 and 1,400. The Mesa West residential ownership overlay, we did hear a good amount of feedback on this ownership overlay, and that the intent may not be working as well as initially intended. So we did not assume any sites in this overlay to accommodate the city's housing need. Some of these parcels, if that overlay were to be removed, may represent potential housing sites that could be considered in another part of the plan or in another overlay if that made sense, but we did not make assumptions based on this area. The 19 West Urban Plan, looking at in specific areas, the potential to go to 50 dwelling units an acre, again, just under the Mesa West Bluffs, given the character of the community, around 40 dwelling units per acre in that area. And so given these, if you add these all up, it goes above the city's current need. And so that's really the consideration, depending on the affordability assumptions that are made and some of the different parcels, and maybe if there are parcels that members of commission or planning or city council or planning commission would want to add, there are plenty of flexibility to move things around at this point. But we did want to talk about 3 potential new areas that don't currently permit housing, but may in the future, if based on this discussion, if that's the feedback that we hear. First is what we're calling 17th Street East, which is currently seeing a very big revitalization, commercial revitalization. We did hear in a number of the workshops, both the district meetings and larger workshops and some of the discussions that we had, that potentially in certain areas, it could be that housing synergizes in a mixed use fashion with the commercial uses there, and could potentially be a really good walkable community, walkable district for that area. We did not make obviously high assumptions. You can see 250 to 275 for the area, just based on the fact that, again, we do have to identify parcels that we think have a realistic capacity to redevelop, and there is so much new redevelopment there that it's unlikely that a lot of those uses are going to turn over. But that being said, there are some older uses there as well that may have potential. We also looked at the airport area, primarily right around Baker Block, as that falls within the noise contours that allow certain development around the airport. So that was a potential constraint in that area, and so the reason that we didn't identify additional parcels, but we did identify a couple that would yield between 825 and 875 in terms of potential units. And then also the city is currently having, thanks to some help with the faith-based community leadership, some discussions with different churches to add residential and particularly lower income residential uses to their properties. Some have either large, maybe unused portions of their property or large parking space areas that may represent good opportunities. We didn't make a high assumption, and again, because some of these sit in current neighborhoods, densities assumptions range from 10 to 30 dwelling units an acre. Those conversations are continuing, and we'll be refining those, but we hope to be able to work with that community to identify potential solutions for lower income housing. So accessory dwelling units is also a major component of the city's housing strategy. And also, again, given sort of the resurgence and kind of the, I'll call it, boom in ADU development based on new laws 2020, there has been an uptick in Costa Mesa in development of accessory dwelling units. They are currently permitted on either single family, detached, attached, or multifamily developments as well, based on new state law. So a large number of the community, percentage of the community in terms of land or housing units could accommodate accessory dwelling units. Based on that, we've made the assumption of approximately 150 accessory dwelling units to be built over the next 8 years. It's a little bit over 100 a year. And the city, this is a little bit based on the city's past performance, but also based on some of the increases that we're seeing. So we currently saw in 2019, the city had just 6 ADUs, and then almost more than tripled to 19 in 2020. And given that was COVID and some hesitancy in development and people's just overall expenses, we actually anticipate 2021 to be even better. And analyzing the applications received for accessory dwelling units, cities received 34 applications so far, just 4 months into the year. So basically going out, that's roughly 100 over the entire year, if that were to continue. And again, that is just applications, but there's a good assumption that the majority of folks who file applications for ADUs are gonna go through and get permits on those. And so the projection is basically anticipated to increase over as new laws come into play and as people get more familiar with these laws, and also timed with the city's housing element program, some of which will promote accessory dwelling unit production, whether through education materials or some other potential opportunities. One thing to note in accessory dwelling units, and the reason that we don't say let's put 5,000 units of our need on accessory dwelling units, is because the city will likely be subject to a 2-year check-in to track ADU development. This is very common among cities. Pretty much every city HCD is asking every city to do this. And that basically is a 2-year check-in to make sure that the city is developing ADUs at the rate in which they anticipated they would. And if not, it almost relates back to similar to a no net loss situation, where if there's an unmet need on ADUs, the city may need to look at different ways to make up the units that are not being produced in terms of accessory dwelling units. So that's why we feel our assumption is pretty accurate. We're continuing to refine that, and we just recently got that updated 34 applications in 2021. So we're continuing to look at the strategy to see if there's a potential to analyze additional capacity within accessory dwelling units, although we found that we're fairly consistent, if not slightly more aggressive than some other cities in around Costa Mesa. And so lastly, I want to talk about some housing programs. Again, housing programs are the actions the city will commit to take within specified time periods. It depends on what the program is. It may be a zoning code amendment, which would be a 3-year period. It may be something like an educational materials that could be drafted earlier than that. Or maybe something that the city needs to do annually, like report their housing element or their housing production, which would just occur every year. So the city is required to analyze each of these programs on a yearly basis. Just like we did a review of past performance for the 5th cycle, every year the city completes their annual progress report, and it does include a status update to the state about how these programs are going, what the progress is, if they've been completed on time. And that's where the city looks to get their compliance and maintain their compliance is through the successful completion of the programs identified within the housing element. So a couple of sample programs, and this is not an exhaustive list, but we wanted to give a good example of what some of the programs we anticipate will be. Zoning amendments to the identified specific plans, urban plans, and overlays based on feedback that we get tonight. If we do end up making revisions to some of those areas, those would be zoning amendments. And again, to kind of reiterate, it's at that point during that 3-year process where the city has the opportunity to slow down a little bit, to look at these areas and say, what's the character of the community? What's the character of these areas? Is this fitting? And what do the development standards look like? And what does the future development in these areas look like? And what will be the best for the city? An inclusionary housing ordinance which, as I mentioned, the city's already working on, at least analyzing the potential for right now. So that's likely to be a program within the housing element. Many cities are developing inclusionary housing ordinances across the Southern California Association of Governments region. Programs to promote accessory dwelling units. These could be a range of different educational materials, all the way up to different review timelines and things like that to address promotion of accessory dwelling units. A review of development standards and processes. This could be just a blanket review to make sure that the city's development standards are functioning the way that they were intended, and potential updates if anything is found that's needing to be addressed. Distribution of housing educational materials. This is a big push among a lot of cities to get more information out into the community, whether that's a video or a pamphlet or online resources. Costa Mesa is really good about getting information about city programs and city projects out. I know that I follow the city's Instagram now being a resident, and I see information on pretty much every project the city does. So those types of information going out just help keep the community more informed about what's going on and what potential housing opportunities are out for different residents. And then a fair housing analysis. So continued outreach to underrepresented communities. The city will have to do an analysis of fair housing as part of the housing element, and we've already begun that process to look at these different areas within the community and how to address potential contributing factors to fair housing. So that will all be included in the draft housing element. Potential creative solutions to housing, such as co-living housing types, not currently considered within the housing, or not currently, I think, permitted within the city, but the potential to have situations like that to allow some more flexibility and get some more creativity in different housing types. The community profile showed that there is a growing population, senior population within Costa Mesa. So looking at potential programs to address senior housing or assisted living that may benefit a larger portion of the population as Costa Mesa continues to age a little bit. And then rehabilitation of housing units. A good amount of the city's housing is over 30 years old, which is considered sort of the cutoff for when housing units may need rehabilitation. That being said, a lot of people make renovations to their homes well before that. So that's not really the world's best indicator, but it is a good indication of when a potential program like that could come into effect. And the city actually currently has a rehabilitation of housing units program within the fifth cycle. So next steps, where we go from here is currently we're at the City Council Planning Commission study session. We will draft, based on the feedback we get tonight, begin to draft the public review draft of the document, which will be available for 30 days to the community. So this is really the opportunity for the community to give their input, for us to conduct the second full round of community outreach. I believe we've sort of already started that with some of our continued conversations, but the town hall meeting number 2, a follow-up on our stakeholder meetings to make sure that we captured information, and that, again, not everything that was said in every meeting will be part of the housing element, but we want to make sure that we've captured what we've heard accurately. And then continued focus meetings with different property owners as we try and determine what are reasonable and realistic assumptions to make on different sites. Following that, I think the plan is to come back to City Council to have a study session to discuss the public comments received on the draft and get City Council feedback before a document is released to HCD. This is just a draft schedule right now. Obviously, there is the ability to modify this if needed, but HCD will review the document for 60 days and provide the city with comments on compliance with state housing law. So with that, next steps are tonight to get feedback from City Council and Planning Commission on the opportunity areas discussed and the recommended densities. Happy to go back to those slides if anybody would like me to later on. And then staff will take the feedback and complete a preliminary public review draft of the housing element document. So with that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. It's a very good and thorough presentation. Before we move on to public comments, is there anybody else from staff that wanted to add anything to Nick's comments?
No, thank you, Mayor. That covers our presentation for this evening. Staff are here and available for questions.
Okay. Well, so here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to hear from the public, and our City Clerk Brenda Green is going to call on the members of the public. And if you wish to speak, you can raise your hand if you're accessing that way, or if you're accessing by phone, to raise your hand, press *9. And when Ms. Green calls on you, you press *6 and you'll be able to talk. You'll get 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, not the 3 minutes we normally get. And but we're happy to hear from you. So Ms. Green, and then after we hear from the public, then we're going to go to introduce and talk from the council and planning commission for questions and comments. So Ms. Green, do we have anybody who wishes to speak from the public?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, we currently have one individual that has their hand raised. Again, if you would like to speak, please raise your hand. Our first speaker will be Linda. Linda, you may speak.
Good evening, council members. My name is Linda, and I wanted to expand on the discussion of density. The staff report highlights that many of the city's urban plans and overlays were developed in 2006, and over the past 15 years, 604 units were developed in the urban plan areas and 200 units were built in the overlay areas. One of the city's strategies to address the city's high RHNA is to increase density in these plans and overlays. It is very encouraging to hear that this is one of the strategies, but my concern, as it has been brought up to all of you at prior meetings, is that the city shouldn't rely on increased density alone because it doesn't necessarily ensure that affordable units will be built. Over the past 15 years, these urban plans or overlays didn't really produce any affordable units. The staff report also states that high quality apartment communities like 580 Anton, the Enclave, and the Lakes are developed up to 125 dwelling units per acre. Unfortunately, even at high density of up to 125 units an acre, that these quote unquote quality communities offered 0 affordable units for lower income households. Instead of just giving away density or development standards that significantly increases the value of a property, the city should ensure a community benefit such as affordable housing will be provided in return. This will also ensure that affordable housing is created to meet the city's lower income RHNA. As the city drafts the housing element, we urge the city to ensure that density and the creation of effective housing policies go hand in hand. For proposed development to access increased density, housing policies such as by right development for 100% affordable developments, or even a set aside of 20% affordability should be implemented in order for these higher densities to be more effective in producing affordable housing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker will be Aaron Clem.
Hi, my name is Aaron Clem. I urge the city to recognize and act on the converging crises of climate change, housing shortages, and racial injustices, and choose a new direction with the housing element to refocus its placemaking for all people over cars. The choice to embrace affirmatively furthering fair housing by right in all neighborhoods will create economic benefits that improve everyone's lives with improved municipal budgets, quieter neighborhoods, cleaner air, more neighbors, and more public space for everyone. AB 1322 provides a solution to the Measure Y issue that the staff report discussed and potentially relieves the city's burden to defend or enforce this exclusionary anti-housing measure. The city should support this bill and utilize the provisions in it to address Measure Y. SB 9 easily passed out of the state Senate this month. Costa Mesa could preserve local control by being proactive in the current housing element by adopting the same standards in its housing element, or be forced to react after it passes with another emergency ordinance. The zoning code requiring a citywide 10-foot setback on exterior side lot lines is not objective and conflicts with state law and will face challenges. The city should act now to create criteria that preserves the streetscape into objective terms, such as when a city-owned parkway is 10 feet or more when measured from the face of the curb to the side lot line, the setback is 4 feet. In closing, I urge City Council to adopt a positive, proactive vision for Costa Mesa by legalizing housing development using objective criteria to reduce discretionary review to the greatest extent possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clem. Who's next?
The next speaker will be Maria Torres.
Hi, good evening. I was wondering if there was going to be an opportunity to review the past cycle to see if there was a balance for the housing development. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Kathy Espohani.
Good evening. I applaud the strategy of amending all the overlays and specific plans to allow greater density. But as one of the prior speakers pointed out, that increased density must be tied to affordable housing requirements. If we have any chance of reaching our RHNA requirement on lower income housing. I also would like to suggest that depending on the density levels allowed in different zones, like for example, I know the proposal is in the North Costa Mesa specific plan that densities of 80 to 90 dwelling units per acre be allowed. And I would assume with density bonuses that density would go even higher. In that case, a much greater percentage of the units should be required to be affordable. That sort of density could certainly support a higher affordability requirement of 25% affordable for lower income. I would also like to address the ADUs. I think ADUs can be a partial solution to the need for affordable housing. But the problem is there's no guarantee that these will be affordable. I know that the staff report is assuming that of 850 projected units, 600 would be affordable, but how will that be guaranteed? So I would like to suggest that the city be creative in coming up with incentives for people to agree to an affordability covenant. And I don't know what to propose there, whether it's waiver of fees, perhaps the city can provide free plans that homeowners can use. Maybe there can be city offered. I don't know, but I think it's certainly worth thinking of how to incentivize affordability components. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Do we have any further public commenters?
Mr. Mayor, we do not.
Okay.
Oh, so, well, we just got one right now. Hold on.
Good. Yeah.
One more.
By the way, hold on one second. If folks who are watching as attendees wish to comment, please do, do the *9 routine or raise your hand so we know you're ready to comment. Okay. We got another one. Go.
The next speaker is phone number ending in 698. Phone number ending in 698, you may speak.
There we go.
You may go ahead.
698. Looks like we're ready for you.
Today's joint special study session, prompted by a pronouncement by some state body that Costa Mesa must rezone to accommodate 11,000 plus housing units to be built in less than half the time it takes to raise an 18-year-old. Ultimately, market economics will dictate whether they be built or not. Will the character of our neighborhoods be preserved? There's lots of talk from the dais about how things are going to change, how displaced residents are going to be replaced or not, priced out or not, even characterizing a generation wanting to own nothing but rent everything. In a city with over 60% renters, is this the direction to head? If you build them, will they be affordable? It's the common refrain leading to many comments during public hearings about this development or that. What I have not heard about is the land under the municipal golf course as an option for the citizens of Costa Mesa to consider. Is this city-owned land a key to low and very low-cost housing? Does anyone think unhoused peeps or the 40% Latino population would rather have a golf course or housing. Is the golf course land and other large city land holdings the gold course to preserving our neighborhood's character, significantly affecting the availability of below market units, or are we going to make over maybe District 4 that has double the population density of the rest of the city and make it even denser? Infill and parcel consolidation yield extremely low actual amounts of low cost housing. The city should put up some of its land bank dedicated largely for low and very low cost housing for discussion to mitigate the potential negative impacts of the RENA zoning demands. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And the last speaker will be Garrett Whitfield.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the time tonight. I just wanted to touch on a couple things. I know that affordable housing is a big concern for a lot of people on the call tonight. I just want to make sure that if that is a direction that the city decides to go, that some thought be put into ways to incentivize affordable housing rather than just regulating it. I think if the idea is to regulate the types of housing and requiring affordability within developments, I think it's going to cause a significant decrease in the amount of development that we're trying to accomplish. And if it really is truly the goal for the city to try and hit the number that was brought down on us, then I think it would be much better in order to provide incentives like by right developments that would increase or expedite the amount of time for review of a project by the city, and allow them to basically start construction or go straight to plan check rather than a city council or planning commission review period. Also, I think that there's some opportunities in order to potentially waive permit fees or parking reductions or allowing for height increases as long as a certain amount of affordability is provided within that development. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So now can we close the public hearing? I don't see anybody else. So close the public comments. Let's do that. And now we're going to go to Planning Commission and City Council comments. And as I said earlier, we're going to share the duties there. I'm going to share with Chair D'Erico. He's going to call on the planning commissioners. I'm going to call on the city council members, and we're going to do it one after another. We're going to go either or. Now, in terms of timing, we're going to not give you a drop dead time. However, I want you to be cognizant of the time. We have 11 council members or planning commissioners by my count. And I think we're trying to get through this by 7 if possible. So that gives us between 5 and 6 minutes. So Chairman D'Erico, why don't you go first? And if a planning commissioner wishes to ask questions or make comments for roughly 5 or 6 minutes, you could do that. You don't have to take that amount of time. We could certainly get out of here by 7 or before 7. But why don't you go first, and then I'll go to and we'll go back and forth until we've gotten all the comments and questions.
Right, okay, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. So commissioners, we'll just do this as our normal meetings. If you have questions of staff or comments, please hit your raise hand button, and I'll get to you. As there's a laundry list here of folks that are here. So go ahead and hit your raise hand button if you don't have any questions. I'm not seeing any. Commissioner Toller, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought this would be more competitive to get the floor, but I have a whole lot to say about this. I have a lot of comments, way more than 5 minutes, but I'm going to set my timer here just to keep track of things. Let's see. Strongtown's founder, Charles Marone, he says something that I want to just keep repeating throughout this process that I think is very wise. No neighborhood can be exempt from change. No neighborhood should experience sudden radical change. I really appreciate staff's showing us those pictures of what density looks like. There's a lot of talk of, this is the metric we're using, right? This is, I get it, dwelling units per acre. That's how we got to turn in our homework. That's how the state wants it, you know, that works at this high level. I do question when that metric comes down to the parcel and project level and is applied as a safeguard and as an indicator of what the built outcome of places are going to be, and applied at the parcel level, as I said. I live in R1 and I live in a little bungalow fourplex. It's 13 DUA, 13 dwelling units per acre. That's double what our code allows. But they look like houses. We have nice little front yards. I have string lights out front. We have dinner out front that are nice and fancy with friends over and wine, and it meets the intent of what R1 is supposed to be. In the old parts of East Side, there's a lot of that old small multiplexes that we used to build with our eyes closed before we started having regulations like minimum lot size, parking requirements, these density caps. Just real quick, a regular lot size, I think our minimum lot size is 6,000 square feet. We got a lot of those. If you get 3 units on that, that's 20 units per acre. 4 units is 30. If you get 6 units on that, so 4, by the way, Sacramento just, I don't know if you guys followed that. Every residential lot by right can do a fourplex. If you get a 6plex, that's 43 units to the acre. What do we picture when we say 43 units to the acre? We were shown a couple of those, 38, 24. Those were all big 3-4 story big projects by big developers. There's a 6plex around the corner from my house, and it looks like a house. It doesn't bother anybody. Everybody, I'll bet nobody knows, except for the mailboxes. There's 6 mailboxes in front. That kind of gives it away. But it meets the intent of what an R1 is supposed to be. R1 meaning quiet, residential, tree-lined streets with 1 and 2 story, 30 feet wide, 40 feet wide, nice boxes with front doors and windows and people out front. So I want to just point everybody, if anybody's taking notes, Portland's doing something really cool. It's called the Residential Infill Project. They're figuring out the rules, some nuanced rules to make sure that these sorts of R1-ish neighborhoods, these single-family neighborhoods that we're always trying to quote-unquote protect, that they're allowed to grow and evolve well. It's all about density, gentle density, density being done well in ways that are sensitive to the things that we actually care about: form, scale, character, right? I would encourage everybody to look at that. And actually what they have is they do have a affordability component built into that. If you can have 4, 5, or 6 units on your residential lot, your regular sized residential lot, if half of them are affordable, and they have some sort of structure. There's nuance there, but I encourage everybody to look at that. I was looking at a new build in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and this was on the back of a residential lot, and it was actually a 10plex. It was 4 stories, and a 10plex should not go in the middle of Mesa Verde or in the middle of the neighborhoods we like. But there are a lot of places where a very small footprint 10plex might work very well. You should see this thing. It's cute. It lands well. The ground floor is good. 125 dwelling units to the acre. So that's my comment on gentle density. Let's look at our existing neighborhoods as well. Let's not try to freeze those in time and try to push all the growth in big project form. I don't want us to depend super heavily and cater to and craft our codes for big developers and big projects only. I hope that we can pave the way for small developments, small, medium-sized, good infill. And when I say small, I don't mean short. I mean small footprints, smaller buildings by local developers. I hope that we can be especially careful with large sites. We've done a few dozen big sites in the last decade or so, and I believe we can do better. Dwelling units per acre is not a predictable indicator of what we're going to get. Large sites should be carved into more Costa Mesa, small walkable blocks, a variety of building types, a variety of densities that shape the new streets, that cut into them, that integrate with the existing network, shape and engage with those streets, new public open spaces. I have two more comments real quick. I'll be real fast. We talked about zoning amendments. Yes, I think before these floodgates open, we definitely need to revisit, not rewrite our entire development code, but key standards in there to ensure that when the floodgates are open, these things come in the best they can be. They come in well. I'm really interested in seeing how we can ensure that new buildings face the street. These are the things that matter. They land well, they face the street, they engage the street. It doesn't create a glut of parking and new traffic everywhere, that they're integrated into our city fabric. Like I said, they create more Costa Mesa rather than being these sealed off, inward oriented pods. Last comment, and I'm done. Open space. As we grow, we need more open space and better open space. That issue becomes more important, and I don't accept the notion that it's a zero-sum game, like we either get housing or open space. It's an either-or thing. Good cities are not oceans of residential as far as the eye can see. No, we need to shape ourselves. We don't want to be a concrete jungle filled with traffic, and I think that's the angst, right? Everybody in Southern California that got hit with these high RHNA numbers are freaking out because they're picturing concrete jungle, ugly, noisy, filled with traffic. We don't have to have that if we do this right. I've mentioned before the idea of using TDR, or transfer of development rights, creatively. I think this would be a new thing. I don't think it's been used like this before, but I looked through the toolbox of ways to create more good open space and preserve existing open space. TDR program, I want to continue bringing that up at each of these meetings. I'm happy to discuss that further with people. And I'm going to end with Christopher Alexander's comment. When the country is far, the city becomes a prison. So let's figure this open space out thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Toller. Mr. Mayor, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, hey, I've got a question real quick for Commissioner Toller, and you don't have to necessarily answer it now, but I think you might know if you think about it. Maybe is there a city that you know of that, you know, in your work and your travels, that you think would be a model city that is like comparable to Costa Mesa in as much as it's like coastal, but maybe not on the coast, that has done a good job with some of the things that you've identified? I mean, it doesn't have to be in California. It could be anywhere in the United States or the world, for that matter.
I think that's a great question, and it's a dangerous question, right? Because all these cities come with baggage. I recently went to Coronado Island in San Diego, and what a great job they do at density. They got old pre-war, missing middle, gentle density stuff, walkable. It's really human scale. That term is misused a lot to mean short buildings only, but human scale. You feel good walking around, like it's built for you, and it's not. That's one, I think. But they haven't. That's just the fabric of that city. I think is something that we might aspire to in certain parts of town. Other cities, just off the top of my head, it's dangerous to throw out Portland. But they're Portland, Oregon. They're some of the policies they've been coming up with in the last few years, I think, are really admirable. Sacramento too, the city of Sacramento, and Davis, California. What they've been doing with bikeability and walkability stuff. I think just off the top of my head, I know those come with negative stuff too, but
Not Davis. I lived 3 years in Davis. I loved it. So
cool.
do we have anybody from the council that wants to go? If not, I've got a couple questions and one comment. All right, I'll go. So, because I don't see anybody raising their hands. Oh, you know what? I'm going to yield to council member Chavez. And by the way, if we have a little bit of time at the end and people want to do seconds, they can do that. But let's give the first people the chance. So Councilmember Chavez, you have the floor.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes,
Commissioner Ayers had his hand up for a little while.
I know.
Yeah, we're kind of swapping back
we're
and forth.
switching.
So.
Oh, we're
Yeah.
switching. I
We're
missed
going
that.
back and forth.
Missed that. Sorry.
All right.
I just wanted to go first and up show Mr. Harris. It's okay. Well, thank you, Mayor, and thank you all the planning commissioners for joining us in this joint endeavor, and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us as well. I think it's always good to get together and as we plan out a big thing for Costa Mesa for our city. Real quickly, a couple things I wanted to point out. I first wanted to thank staff for listening to myself and Member Reynolds and others in the council on changing the Mesa West ownership overlay. As you may know, if you live in District 4, essentially what we were doing was we were incentivizing home ownership, creating less density, AKA less homes, to have ownership versus renters, which is the opposite we want to do. Costa Mesa is majority renters. It's also around 48% below the moderate income of Orange County. Let's not forget that that's half of our city. So we have to accommodate everyone, not just the higher end folks. And that's kind of where my comments today will begin. As we look forward to this housing element, there's a couple things that I think are important. One, how can we best maximize our land without removing residents, right? So in my eyes, that means looking at industrial zones, seeing if it can become mixed use with like lower level, like storefronts, upper level housing, to incentivize walkability, to remove cars from the equation more or less so, but also still allow opportunities for us to build more housing without removing folks who already live in Costa Mesa. That's really important to me in my district because we are the most dense district in the city. I mean, it's really crazy how dense we are when you compare us to the fact that I have the same population as District 1 in Mesa Verde, right? Crazy. Alongside those points, we really have to be having this discussion about, we have all these new plans coming in, and my question to staff is always going to be this: will Measure Y allow us the opportunity to actually create these overlays? Will Measure Y allow us the opportunity to actually build housing? Because I know when I voted for Measure Y in 2016, I voted for one reason. I was tired of seeing my neighbors be removed for condominiums. I was tired of seeing folks that I grew up with being evicted to make way for homes we couldn't afford. And I feel like by us removing the ownership overlay in West Costa Mesa, my fear and my reason for voting for Measure Y is now gone. And now I'm looking at my young friends who are in my district, who are choosing to live with their parents because they want to be in Costa Mesa so bad, they're willing to stay in their childhood bedroom, opposed to move from Costa Mesa because they love Costa Mesa so much. Like, where are they going to live? That's the thing we have to be thinking about. Where are kids going to live? Because as our kids get older, they're going to want to stay at Costa Mesa because it's the best city in Orange County in the world, in my opinion. And what are we going to do to make sure they actually stay here? And finally, on terms of the three new ownership plans, and give me a moment to pull them up because I actually not see them on the council agenda packet. I think those are good creative ideas. In terms of the 17th Street East, I think it fits with the idea I have of making like commercial areas a bit more like mixed use. If it works, it does great. If it doesn't, we tried and we move on. But ultimately, I think promoting that mixed use is important. For the airport area, same thing. I personally believe we can have maximized density outside the freeway ring. That's what I call it. North of the 405, north of the 783, not really east of 55 because that's east side Costa Mesa, but really north of 405, north of 73. That's really where we can maximize our density. And when you think about it, a lot of amenities are already there that attract young professionals, right? With Cam in the lab, South Coast Plaza. You have the fact that we're having new businesses coming in to the press. Like, we want to be creating an attractive environment so folks my age are not leaving a Tustin and not leaving an Irvine. I want them here in Costa Mesa spending money in our city, making sure we have better revenue for Costa Mesa. So I think that's really where we should be focusing on the density part. Anything south of that is really filling in pockets, but ultimately mixed use is my vision. And last thing I want to comment on is the church properties. I know this has been coming up before. I want to thank the churches for doing this, because really when it comes down to building real affordable units, it really comes down to developers knowing the plan, having guarantees that they can make a profit down the margin lines, because ultimately it's really hard to make low income housing. So any way, anytime you can partner with local churches to use their excess lots or excess facilities to build a true affordable housing, I think we should maximize that. And I think, quite frankly, we should be proactive in finding partners who are willing to do that. Because as mentioned before, it's going to be really hard to create real affordability without higher density. Given Costa Mesa's nature and structure, I don't think that really will happen unless you're north of that like freeway corridor, north of 405, number 73. So I think we should be creative where we can, and that's my comments for tonight. So thank you guys.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Commissioner Areth was next.
Thank you, Chair DeAricol. I appreciate it. I'd like to start by thanking Mayor Stevens for the appointment and for the rest of City Council for their unanimous approval and my appointment to the Planning Commission. So thank you very much. It's going to be a wonderful experience, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on the Planning Commission. I won't take up too much time, but I do have a series of questions that I'd like to ask, and when appropriate, I'll hopefully call out the right people. So I'll start out with Mr. Preziosi. Are there any updates on Measure Y in terms of the Citizens Advisory Committee?
Thank you, Commissioner Areth. No, we have not formally proceeded to create the Citizens Advisory Committee, although we are in that process.
Okay, thank you. My second question is perhaps for my fellow commissioners or staff. This is a two-part question. Have we audited the current zoning regulations to streamline development efforts? And by extension, is there a current list of proposed amendments to the zoning regulations, including their specific plans, urban plans, and overlays, given different and diverging visions for growth?
That's probably a Ms. Lee question, Commissioner Areth.
Thank you, Chair. I would say that although there is not, I would say, a comprehensive list of updates for the zoning code, there's certainly feedback that staff have received over time from both council and the Planning Commission as to specific development standards or specific plans that that they just feel don't reflect the vision of the community any longer. So it's not a formal list, but it's certainly something that staff tracks and every year prioritizes for council. But also I would say that going through the housing element process, as well as the zoning actions that will follow, is really the opportunity to do that sort of audit, I would say.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'd look forward to seeing that list or that audit at some point. And thank you. And lastly, has the water district and the sanitary district been solicited to gather input on their capacity to service the different specific plans, urban plans, and overlays that we discussed this evening?
At the housing element level, essentially there is a high level analysis, and that includes reaching out to our infrastructure providers as to capacity. But ultimately infrastructure planning is done in the next phase, kind of post housing element, as we really get into the details of how exactly we can ensure that some of the high level things that we're talking about in the housing element transition to the types of communities that we want to see. And that includes infrastructure planning.
Great, thank you so much. And that's all for my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Mayor?
Okay. I don't see another hand raised, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions, as I said. So with respect to ADUs, I want to get some clarity on the 850 number, because I believe it was portrayed in the staff report as a projection, and also in the in the oral comments, but then on the slide, it said 850 potential sites. So is the 850 over the 8-year period, how much staff anticipates that ADUs are going to be built? Or is that the maximum that can be built if all of the available ADUs are built?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Stevens. I'll take that one. That is basically the first option that you put up there. It is a projection. It is not the maximum number of units. It's just staff's projection on ADUs that may be built within the community, and they could be developed anywhere within the community that ADUs are permitted. It's not part of the housing element to try and select individual sites or anything like that for ADUs. It's separate, and it's a projection based on past performance and on new state law and projection trends that are showing in the community, like the 34 applications received in 2021.
And what are the maximum amount of lots that qualify to build an ADU? If you know that, if somebody knows that off the top of their head. I
may defer to staff a little bit, but essentially any single family, whether it's detached or attached, and
no, I know, no.
I
don't care about that. I want a number.
Okay, I do not have the number off the top of my head.
Okay, I'm just trying to get the number. Will help me do a reasonableness test for the 850 unit ADU estimate, which to me, my gut tells me that that's high. Okay, over 8 years. Now, one more question about the ADUs. There's talk about making them affordable or whatever in terms of renting. But my understanding of ADUs, they're sometimes called granny flats, is they're not necessarily to rent out in all cases, but oftentimes a family member will live in that ADU, so you could have kind of that multi-generational living. Nick, do you or does anybody else on the panel know what's the rough percentage of renting of ADUs versus somebody in the family living in the ADUs rent-free? Does anybody have that data?
I don't believe we have that data, or at least we haven't analyzed it yet. The city would have to either survey existing ADUs or take some kind of action to survey and get that information. I did want to just real quickly, because I think Jennifer is going to answer as well potentially. But to your first question, that roughly 850 number, Mayor Stevens, is about 5% of the city's single-family detached units. So not counting units that could be built on single-family attached or multifamily, just the single-family detached, it's about 5% of that total number.
All right. Helps. Well, maybe it's then that indicates maybe it's a more reasonable estimate. Thank you for that. Okay. So at the bottom of page 3 of the staff report, there's a sentence that I want to explore a little bit. It's the last bullet, and it reads, Costa Mesa experienced the lowest growth in new housing units in the past decade in comparison to neighboring cities. Okay. So has anybody looked at, whether that, I want to use 2016 as the midpoint, which I think is fair, right? If we go back to 2011, that's a decade. And so 2016, of course, was significant because that's when Measure Y was passed by the voters. Has anybody looked at the amount of new housing units that were from 2011 to 2016 versus from 2016 to 2021, and have we done that comparison?
We have not done that as part of the housing element. I would refer to Jennifer to know if they've taken a look at that separately, but it's not part of the housing element process. Okay, well, then forget about the hypothesis that's embedded in that question. So my question is this: why has Costa Mesa experienced the lowest growth in new housing units in the past decade in comparison to neighboring cities? Why? I would be guessing if I threw out answers, and I don't know if you're. Well, don't. I'm not asking you. I'm asking
Anyone who has, well, Ms. Lee, why? Mrs. Shabi, why? Why? Anybody else? Any other person on the call? Any commissioner? Why?
Mr. Mayor, the chief key reason is a high barrier to entry, lack of certainty in the development community, out of state parking standards, a whole host of reasons. But I would say that taking on the risk of investing millions of dollars to have to go to a public vote for approval is a spooky proposition for the development community.
All right, got it. Anyway, so then that ends my questions. And I didn't even realize the kind of the double entendre to the question, the last question. But anyhow, so I just think what we should strive to do is this. And when I was asking a community member, why should we have affordable housing? What's the best argument for affordable housing? And the answer somebody gave me is one that I've said a few times, but is we want to have an opportunity for people of all ages to live. We want to have an opportunity for people at all stages of their lives to live and to continue to live in our city. And as I look over this screen and I see people like Councilmember Gameros and Councilmember Reynolds and Councilmember Chavez and Commissioner Arith, and I see these leaders, and you see them all, not just on this screen, you see them all over, people that are homegrown Costa Mesa residents who have grown up in the city, gone to school in the city, and then continued to serve the city. We have a proud tradition of that in Costa Mesa going over many generations. I think that that's a worthy thing. And so when we put these plans together, they're not just about, numbers, arena numbers or whatever. I think that what we're trying to achieve is a resilient, multi-generational community. And we're lucky to have that because there's many cities that when somebody graduates from high school, they couldn't quickly enough kick the dust off that crummy town and move someplace else. And some of us are from those towns. But the Costa Mesa is not one of them. Costa Mesa is a place where people want to live and they want to have generational living. We should be proud of that. And we should do what we can to achieve that. This is a great opportunity to do that. And I appreciate all the hard work from staff and from the commissioners and the council members to try to achieve that goal. If you do agree with me that that's a worthwhile goal. So back to you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Commissioner Torje, you're up.
All right, thank you so much, Chair and Mayor. I'm glad to be here with you all today. I joined a little late, so I wasn't able to see the presentation, but I've been able to dive into the documents and know and be able to see the hard work that staff and the consultant team have put into this process. I didn't see the presentation, but I'm going to ask a question with a follow-up question for Mr. Chen. Can you talk about what affirmatively furthering fair housing means in terms of geography in Costa Mesa?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Torje. So affirmatively furthering fair housing in terms of the analysis for the housing element requires the city to look at the different both demographic makeup and historical sort of potential patterns of segregation within the community. So that analysis is currently taking place and it revolves around a number of different sources that look at opportunity maps and opportunity analysis and contributing factors and contributing indicators to fair housing. And so essentially, to kind of keep the answer a little bit short, is I don't have an answer for that specific to Costa Mesa yet. That will be within the document of the housing element and as part of the analysis in terms of what goes into the remaining of the sites analysis that we're looking at as we start to pare down the sites that we've identified as now essentially.
Okay. And so what I heard is that there's a lot of factors that go into affirmatively furthering for housing. And there's a couple documents that we have, and one of them is the map of housing opportunity sites. And on the map of where they're identified, I see housing opportunity sites throughout a lot of the city, but there's a lot of areas that we aren't identifying housing for. And I'm assuming those are single family zoning, and we're identifying ADUs or accessory dwelling units as being the affordable housing or the housing development that goes within those single family areas.
Yes, that's a correct assumption. And I'll also add that I think the city has the opportunity to look at potentially solutions like Commissioner Toller was discussing as part of the housing element or after the housing element as part of some of the implementing programs. Part of the reason why traditionally some of those areas don't get identified is partially because of sizing requirements based on AB 1397, and also because of the realistic assumption component of the law. So when HCD requires us to look at realistic assumption, in those instances, a lot of cases would be the combination of a lot of very small parcels with a lot of different property owners, and that just lowers the reasonability assumption that could potentially be redeveloped for housing. But I think there are options for potential housing units, ADUs included within those areas.
Okay, great, thank you. That's really helpful. And Council Member Chavez mentioned as I was coming on that there's, and something that I really appreciated about the sites, and it seems like you heard well from the community, that there's not an over concentration of density in the west side. I think we tend to, or at least I've tended to in the past, and I could see something happening in the future where we see density and say there's density so we can increase density there, but oftentimes that's displacement. And so I appreciate the thoughtfulness towards density and looking at what that looks like to allow for thoughtful density in different parts of the community. I think when I think about the protection of single family zoning, is that we oftentimes when we think about what's replaced and what's not replaced in a community is what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so we allow a lot of things in industrial and multifamily neighborhoods, and we don't allow a lot of uses in single family neighborhoods. And so I think there's a benefit to that. And then I think there's also challenges when we're thinking about where we're going to put about 12,000 units. And so again, I appreciated the hard work that was put into this as well. I wanted to just note the airport area and thinking about what we're proposing for that area and the areas north of the 405 in terms of the amenities we provide for folks and the infrastructure. I'm guessing that most cities in this area will be proposing high density housing around the airport. And when we're thinking about concentrating, if it's low income mixed with above moderate, but thinking about concentrating people around uses where there's air quality issues, whether we're creating environmental justice issues, is something we're going to have to be cognizant about and thoughtful about. But I know this council and the commission and staff is really thoughtful about what that means to put high density around areas where there's air quality issues and maybe not access to grocery stores. But I did want to note that as just a comment as we're looking at what we're doing with density. And again, I've mentioned like, let's put density some places and other places. It's like there's no easy answers. And so I know that this is a wicked problem we're solving here together. And so those are my big questions. I was really impressed with the different sites that were identified. I will ask, I do have one more comment and one more question. I believe it is the 19 West Urban Plan. So on page 13 of the staff report, there's identifying removing the Mesa West residential ownership overlay, which I will applaud here. And then note that there's some looking at the 19 West Urban Plan where there's proposed density of 50 dwelling units per acre along 19th Street. And if you look at the units behind what those units are proposed, it's higher density or high occupancy, low income communities. And so am thinking about displacement as we're thinking about those sites there and what that would look like to have 50 dwelling units per acre on sites that are abutting our lowest income communities in Costa Mesa. And so I think just as we're thinking through what the implications of that might be, but I'm not suggesting reducing that or moving that somewhere else. But again, thank you all for the presentation and the great staff report as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Torje. Mr. Mayor, go ahead.
Thank you. Next up is our Mayor Pro Tem, Andrea Marr.
Thank you, Mayor Stevens. Would it be possible for us to put up the map that Commissioner Torje was talking about so eloquently?
Absolutely. Just give me 1 second.
I actually just want to make sure I understand it, to be perfectly honest. I don't have any like brilliant questions about it. I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Yes, you should be able to see it, and I can zoom in and out to different areas if you'd like.
Gotcha. Okay. So in attachment 2 of the staff report, there was references. I'm looking at Harbor Boulevard, for example, proposed residential development be allowed in a mixed-use context. Along Harbor Corridor, encouraged, proposed to extend northern boundary. So have we identified those extensions of the boundaries above and beyond what exists in the overlay now on this map?
We have not identified the boundaries, no. That would come as part of the implementing program, but it would, if sites were identified in the housing element to be a part of that, the boundary extension would need to at least cover those sites that were identified.
Gotcha. So is this map just reflective of like what exists in the existing specific plans as it relates to site identification, or are there sites on top of what's provided in this map that will be included as this process develops?
No, this map does have all the sites that currently are being identified, and based on affordability assumptions, there's a path to meet the city's need based on this map. There's also a number of other potential options based on, again, affordability assumptions and some other programs the city could put into place to where sites could come off, sites could be added if council or planning commission saw fit. There's a lot of flexibility right now.
Gotcha. Okay. And so I'm looking like along Newport Boulevard, along the slip road, for example. How did we identify those sites? Are they specifically out of one of the overlays, or are they underutilized commercial zones?
They are a mixture. So a number of those are parcels large enough to meet some of the sizing requirements that the state has put in place, but also taking a look at the existing uses to see whether we think there's the potential. Again, there's still some analysis to be done in terms of the existing uses to really dig into that, as well as just some outreach to those different areas. But these sites do meet sizing requirements. We would look at these sites and say there's a reasonable potential based on the existing use that it could redevelop for housing. It's not required to. I think one thing that I meant to stress in the presentation that I didn't is that sites identified in the housing element are not required to redevelop for housing. It is just basically the city showing the state that there's capacity within the city to accommodate the city's RHNA. As one of the speakers mentioned, the market will decide what sites get developed and what doesn't. But it's the city who is able to set the framework of that through these urban plans and overlays to say what development will look like in these areas. But if a parcel, next to one of the ones we identified were to redevelop and not the parcel we identified, the city gets the same credit.
Gotcha. Okay, you can stop sharing the map. Yeah, I mean, I guess my comments would just be limited to the idea that, like, I understand we've got to find sites that sort of pass the smell test for the purposes of the state and for getting through the housing element process. But I do think if one of the outcomes is additional corridor planning and a relook at many of our specific plans and existing overlays, that we want to be really as comprehensive and as thoughtful as possible. I think that threading the needle between a site being sort of ripe for redevelopment is difficult without the context that a corridor plan would potentially provide. And so if we were able to do some actual visioning on 19th Harbor and Newport Boulevard and say, here's the potential, we've got enough of a setback, we could put down a bike path, we've got enough existing density that it wouldn't look weird to have a couple of additional three-store buildings on Harbor or on Newport. I think if we were sort of looking in that context, that would open up additional sites. So I just want to, I guess I I'm saying this out loud for myself as much as for the public right now, that doing what we need to do to sort of check the box for the purposes of the housing element process is also not, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Chen, is also not sort of the potential all-inclusive process that a visioning of our corridor plans might present.
You're correct. Yeah, as we mentioned, this is really in some ways, the housing element is really the beginning in terms of establishing what the city will put into the programs and ultimately implement as part of those programs.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem, I would say also that you'll see that in the language that we use when we're talking about housing opportunity areas, because what we're doing now is essentially identifying parcels that we see based on characteristics that we're looking at for purposes of establishing for the state that we do have capacity in Costa Mesa, but ultimately the corridor plans that we adopt, the specific plans, the overlays that ultimately we plan for and vision for in the future, those can have different boundaries, much more discussion about development standards and how we transition from this high level discussion down to really the communities that we want to plan for. So it's certainly a starting point.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate that I definitely think an outcome, and I was happy to see it through so much of the public engagement. One of the outcomes of this process should certainly be taking another look at our corridors in particular and going through a visioning exercise. I'm happy to see the inclusionary housing ordinances continue to be discussed. I want us to get it done. I know we've been talking about it for a long time. There was mention of the Measure Y kind of advisory committee a year ago. The pandemic prevented many of our committees and commissions from meeting for a period of time. So I want to be clear with the public that that is still very much my intent to negotiate that process and what development over the next, what the future of the city looks like. But we need to do it in a thoughtful way, and that will be coming back as far as I'm concerned. And then there's one other thing off the top of my head. Oh yeah, to the point about environmental justice. So again, Commissioner Touré, thanks so much for bringing that up. That's a really good point. Separate and apart from this conversation, I do think that having a conversation about reach codes and setting our own design and building standards, potentially such that we're able to provide more electrification, provide sort of cleaner environments as part of this building process, will be something that we should probably look into. And I know Councilmember Reynolds, there you are, Councilmember Reynolds has put some thought into this as well. So for future discussion as this evolves. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman, you're up.
Commissioner Russell, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions or comments. First of all, thank you to the staff for putting together such a good report. It was very comprehensive. And I also want to thank residents for pointing out the need to encourage affordable housing to the greatest extent possible. I mean, we can have high density, and it will be market rate if they build it. That's not an issue. We have to figure out how to make it affordable. Clearly, we need housing for all levels in Costa Mesa. And I guess as Councilman Chavez is, I'm especially concerned about attracting and keeping young working families in the community. Moderate income families can't afford to live here, and having them in the community contributes to a vibrant city. I too was glad to see a recommendation that the Mesa West residential ownership plan be removed, and that we need to make sure that as we change zoning and put in new land use policies, that we really do become aware of who's already there and how to avoid displacing them. On the Citizens Committee to review Measure Y, obviously we're going to have to do more density in a lot of different parts of the city, and it does seem to be a serious constraint. And since it did come out of citizens' concerns about development, I'm glad to see that we're going to be putting residents, giving them the opportunity to have some input. Just a couple of things I wanted to highlight in the plan that we haven't really talked about, which is multi-generational housing, and also co-living residents. I've read some articles about how that's becoming more and more popular, and it's a great way to get density and actually get to generate some synergy in terms of people being able to live together and share ideas. I'm excited to hear about this discussions with Trellis and the churches. That's a great opportunity to provide for low-income residents. And lastly, I look forward to hearing more about the LEAP funding, so that after we get the housing element done, that we have an opportunity to do some additional visioning. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Russell. Go ahead, Mr. Mayor.
Next is Councilmember Gameros from District 2.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I just want to congratulate Adam Meredith on his appointment to the Commissioners Planning Commission. I do look forward to his perspective in the future. I do have some questions for staff. One of my questions is, if a developer was to come in to do a development and trigger Measure Y, what would they have to do before it goes to a vote? Can anyone answer that?
So maybe just an introduction, and hopefully I'll get to answer to your question in my explanation. But essentially, we have a couple of criteria for triggering Measure Y. And the first one is that the proposal has to involve a general plan amendment, specific plan amendment, or zone change. So that's the first criteria. And then the second criteria is when it involves one of those three types of actions, it also has to include at least 40 dwelling units above what would be existing under the base zoning, and then or 10,000 square feet of additional building area. And there are a number of other specified criteria. So that's how to trigger Measure Y to begin with when you're a development project. So you're essentially submitting an application to the city for one of those three legislative approvals. You're going through the process of site planning, architectural planning, and preparing all of the environmental studies and technical studies that are necessary to comply with state environmental laws. Beyond that, you're scheduled for a public hearing at the Planning Commission, and then ultimately a public hearing with the City Council. And after, there's the decision to place the project on a ballot for voter approval. So those are sort of the steps involved.
Okay, thank you. And when it goes to ballot for public approval, who pays for that?
You know, Councilmember Gameros, if it goes in the next regularly scheduled election, the city would pay for it. The applicant has the option to put it on a special election, in which case the applicant has to pay for it under Measure Y.
Okay, so if the applicant was to have to pay for it, do we know how much it would cost?
You know, I don't have the actual figures, and it would likely be in excess of $60,000, but perhaps the city clerk can opine a little more on that.
I'll hope that Brenda can weigh in here, but I can just tell you that the cost of a special election depends very much on when it is and whether there are other cities in the county that may be holding a special election at the same time. But I think Ms. Green can probably elaborate.
Thank you. A good estimate, if it's a standalone special election, could be anywhere between $300,000 and $500,000. If it's just on its own. If it happens to be tied in with, say, one other city had a special election going on also, then the cost would be reduced, but maybe to like $200,000. So it behooves a developer to consolidate with the city for a general election, and then the costs are very much minimal.
Okay, thank you very much. Byron, I think you might have had something you wanted to say. I might want to hear it.
I don't know. Did I give it away?
Okay,
Right.
sorry. I thought I might have been
That's all right.
something good. Okay, thank you very much. Those are all of my questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Gameros. Do you have anybody on deck, Chairman?
I don't see any hands raised immediately, and I'll go ahead and make my comments, and I have a few questions, and then see if Vice Chair Colbert wants to pitch in. I just want to, my top line comment, kind of, I'm gonna go from 30,000 feet to 20 and then come on down to the ground here. I want to compliment staff and Kimberly Horn on what I think is an excellent initial work product. I was actually pleasantly surprised, not because I don't believe in the talents of Kimberly Horn and the staff, but because it was much more thorough and in depth than I thought it would be at this first stage. So you guys did a terrific job, and the community deserves a lot of credit as well, because they were actively involved in the outreach effort and in some of the community meetings, and even in the district community meetings where I thought there was some really interesting discussion going on. I'm thrilled really by the kind of framework of the opportunity sites that have been identified. And I think they kind of reflect well, one, the tremendous requirement that the state and SCAG has put on us relative to our arena number. And if you look at that 12,000 number and you go, oh, heck, where are we going to put all this stuff? It really kind of staggers the mind. And then I looked at this map and this list, and I looked at the proposed densities, and I thought, you know what, this might actually be doable. And that is, again, testament to staff's work and Kimberly Horn's work in identifying these properties. And as well as I want to also compliment the stakeholders, particularly the major property owners who've had conversations with staff about how they can participate in this process and contribute to the city's housing needs. So those two things said, I'm really excited about these opportunity sites. And in particular, I'm going to come down a few feet more. I've always felt that to get community support for this process and to get community support for our plan, for this housing element plan, that the bulk of the density was going to have to occur north of the freeway. And I continue to believe that, while I appreciate Commissioner Toller's remarks, and I think there's some good opportunities where we can provide more housing in our R1 and R2 neighborhoods through ADUs or even JDUs. And I might have a question on that at some point about how we might, how JDUs might figure into the process. You know, I think if the community is going to support this, we have to figure out a way to provide more housing in our R1 and R2 neighborhoods, but not to the extent where the community perceives that R1 is basically disappearing and we're going to create essentially multifamily neighborhoods throughout Costa Mesa. I think the community to that extent will revolt, and I think we will have no support for this housing element if we approach this with the idea that we need to spread density equally throughout the city. I just don't see the community supporting it. I think that north of the freeway makes the most sense, where the bulk of this is going to happen. But you know, having said that, here's what I'm really excited about: is Costa Mesa is unique from my perspective in that, and I go around to a lot of cities. We have a lot of different corridors that could be different places. We could make them different places. And I think when I look at the Newport Boulevard specific plan, or I look at the Harbor Boulevard mixed use overlay that's identified in the opportunity matrix, and the 19 West Urban Plan, and I have to imagine that Councilmember Reynolds is probably drooling over what could be done with 19th Street out to the Bluffs, and even 17th Street East. Those are great corridors for placemaking. And to kind of piggyback into what Councilmember Chavez said about, you know, he's kind of preaching mixed use. I'll be on the same bandwagon with him, because particularly in these corridors, Harbor, 19th, 17th, Newport Boulevard. One of the things that's going to be challenging for the city manager and the finance director as we go through this housing element is, given everything that's going on with COVID and e-commerce, how are we going to create and preserve our tax base? It's going to have to be a hybrid of different land uses that Costa Mesa wasn't built on. We were commercial zoned and residential zones, and we don't have a lot of mixed use. And I think Harbor and 19th and 17th and Newport Boulevard are going to be the great areas where we can create these mixed use places, I'll say, that have their own identity. They don't have to look the same, but that integrate in kind of service, whether it's service, resident serving retail on the ground floor, or maybe it's more citywide serving retail. But it creates abilities for entrepreneurship, creates abilities for all sorts of people, disadvantaged people, minorities, to establish businesses in these corridors. And I think that as we approach this, and I would convey this to Ms. Lee and Mr. Chen, that let's really focus on how we can make places on these corridors that integrate, that are mixed use. Because that's the only way I think we're going to create something that's really interesting looking, that's on a human scale, that's going to give Ms. Farrell Harrison the tax base that's going to continue to produce the revenue that the city needs to operate. And then as we look north at the Newport, or the North Costa Mesa specific plan area, to me, as I see it, that's Costa Mesa's future urban core. I don't think our urban core is going to be south of the freeway. I think our urban core is going to be north of the freeway. That's where the arts are. That's where the job centers are coming. Andoril, that's, I was looking at the numbers here. This was really disheartening to me that 47% of our population is in some low income category. And then the other thing is that the median income in Costa Mesa is a little over 7% below the regional median, which tells me that we need better quality jobs in Costa Mesa. And I think when we have like companies like Andoril coming in, and then we're creating these kind of residential cores around them where people can walk to work, so they may not necessarily have to have the cost of a car or public transit, or they go walk or ride to work. We have an inclusionary housing ordinance that builds in an affordability component into some of these projects. Then we create an ability for people to earn better livings and afford places, and we can bring our median income up, and we don't have to be 7% below the regional median. And we can have more people that are Costa Mesans who are in the moderate or above moderate categories. So I think that those areas are, I think we're just spot on in what we've done in identifying our opportunity sites. Having said that, I wanted to ask a few questions. Is it our anticipation that the densities or the draft densities identified in this opportunity site are base densities and would not include anything that an applicant would try to seek in terms of a density bonus?
That's correct, Chair D'Arcolo. Those would be the max density permitted by the zoning code, and then there would be density bonus.
Okay, perfect. That's what I was hoping you'd say. And then, Mr. Chen, you can help me understand this. You mentioned the noise contours for the airport, and I want to make sure I understand. Is that a hard regulation, or is that a discretionary kind of review by Airport Land Use Commission? Because I'm looking, if everybody knows, there's Newport Beach City Council approved basically a general plan amendment for Newport Airport Village, which is like right next to campus, going up towards MacArthur, for 444 units and about 300,000 square feet of retail. And I mean, that's smack dab against the airport. So I want to understand what the noise contour restrictions actually are. If the restrictions are, they're kind of like just kind of a guideline that ALAC looks at, and sometimes they they say no and sometimes they say yes.
Mhm. Yeah, I may actually defer to Mrs. Shabi, who was the member of staff who dug a little bit more into that.
Good evening, Chair Derico. Basically, the noise contours that are part of the A loop, which is the airport land use environment plans, includes the 65 CNEL. The 65 CNEL is also in the city's general plan in terms of acceptable levels of noise for outdoor and livability standpoint for residential. So those are the two criteria we use to determine that. And the Airport Land Use Commission also does have authority to review any projects within those areas.
Okay, and are ALEC's decisions on those projects advisory, or it's because I know local jurisdictions have the ability to kind of override those decisions?
That is correct. The city council could override that decision.
Okay, and is it feasible, let's say in a project that was in the noise contour, if a noise study determined that the residents were going to be subjected to something over 65 CNEL, that a condition of approval could be soundproofing windows or whatever it is to kind of bring everything under 65?
That is one way to mitigate it, but it's would be very hard to do it for outdoor open space. For indoor, definitely we do have areas that are along commercial corridors that are noisy, and they do apply that standard for interior noise levels.
All residents would get a free pair of headphones and they could go out and sit by the pool. So okay, so constraints. So Mr. Preziosi, or are we, so within Measure Y, there's a provision about, there's an exempt provision about affordability projects or related to affordable projects that are part of some kind of state or federal law or required by state or federal law. So are we analyzing that to determine what that actually means and what the envelope of that looks like?
Thank you, Chair D'Arco. We have analyzed that, and it applies in very narrow situations where there's close to 100% affordability, or it has certain categories, none of which have applied to any of the development projects that we've seen come forward thus far.
Okay, so I guess I would suggest to maybe Mayor Pro Tem Maru, whoever the Measure Y Citizens Advisory Committee is, to look at the notion that a housing project coming forward that has that's, we have an inclusionary housing ordinance, they're coming in with at least 15% or whatever the number is going to be, and that project is identified on a housing opportunity site, that would be criteria that would exempt that project from Y. So it's essentially, because it's a project that's part of a housing opportunity site, that's part of our housing element, which is a affordable housing document required by state law, that it would be exempt from Measure Y. Maybe I'm watching Miss Barlow go, he's not a lawyer, he should be quiet. So
no, I'm not saying that, Chair D'Arco. Okay. I'm not even thinking it in my head.
Okay, very good.
What I am saying is that we've looked at this, and we do think that at a minimum, clarification of Measure Y should be made to be more specific about what is actually, what it does mean by required by state or federal law. In the absence of, let's say, a contract for federal funding, it's very difficult to identify what a particular level of affordable housing might be required by state or federal law without more clarification.
Okay, thank you. I'm almost done, Mr. Mayor. I'm sorry, I'm violating your rule, which you can beat me up for later.
No, it's all right. It's going to cost you 2 strokes.
2-stroke penalty, all right. Mr. Preziosi, we're talking about, one of the topics was about streamlining, and we're seeing this a lot, particularly in Sacramento legislation that seeks to streamline entitlement and application. I just want to make sure that that we are monitoring all of those very closely because there's a slew of them, and some of them are competing and others aren't. But I want to make sure we understand in crafting procedures and processes for development project applications, that we're just mindful of what the state is going to require, if they require anything, what becomes by right, what goes through an expedited process, all of that kind of stuff, because that's going to have an impact on how I think we look at managing development projects as they come through. And that's streamlining, and I think Mr. Whitfield said, is an important thing that the development community looks at, because time is money, and in that industry. And so I want to make sure we're kind of looking at our procedures in the context of these pieces of legislation that may or may not become law. That's why I've just asked that we monitor them very closely. And then finally, and this is my last comment, Mr. Mayor. As we get down the line and we go into the second phase after the housing elements, which means starting to look at our other elements of our general plan and our zoning and our regulations and all that. I'm going to go back to the corridors, and this could work for the Costa Mesa, North Mesa specific plan as well. But I really think, we talked about development standards and setbacks and all that stuff. I really think that we should move away from a really strict code-based standards and start looking at form-based code. Form-based code gives, almost kind of creates the physical environment in an envelope. It's happening. I'm working in a city up in San Ramon that has had a specific plan for a few years now called the San Pablo Avenue specific plan. And they're going through an update of it right now. But that whole specific plan is constructed on form-based code. And they've had a really outstanding response to it from the community and from the development community. And it allows the jurisdiction and the community to envision, if this gets built, this is essentially what it'll look like. In Orange, they're doing a North Tustin specific plan, which is brand new from about Catella to up to Lincoln. And I think they're strongly looking at the notion of form-based code to kind of create a place that creates the kind of relationship, as Commissioner Toller talks about, between the structure and the street and the human scale of it, and how much retail needs to be on the ground floor, and whether or not there are any setbacks at all, if the sidewalk's right up against the building, or if you have some setback, you can create different looks. But I'm really, provided I'm around, we're running out of time, but form-based code is a really important component, I think, of how we implement this housing element once we get past it. So enough from me. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your indulgence, and we'll go from there.
Oh yeah, no, it was great feedback. Thank you.
Good job by staff, though. I think we're on the right track.
So now, oh, he's not the last speaker. If only. But we got two really good speakers coming up. Former vice chair of the Planning Commission, current council member from the Great District 6, and really knows his stuff about this. Let's hear it from Jeff Harlan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is by no means intentional to be batting cleanup here, but I think the benefit is that I think at least the public has heard that we really have very strong group here who's incredibly thoughtful and intelligent, and I would say sophisticated about a very complex topic. So I'm very confident that my fellow council members and commissioners are taking this seriously and really offering, I think, some very good comments and direction for both staff as well as for the community. I just have three kind of broad topics, and I'll be very quick about them. One is about the information that we've gathered to date. You can probably hear my dog in the background there. He's very excited about the housing element. Second would be about how we present this information. And then third is just implementation of the housing element, and in particular, how we're going to administer housing programs. So on the first issue of information, I really want to echo the comments commending staff and our consultant team in putting together where we are to date. You know, I was really hoping that we would get into more detail on the community profile today. I think that is a vital piece of information for us moving forward. And in fact, what I really want to say about information is that I really think that we need to have a strong analytical underpinning for whatever we do. And by that, I mean that we can point to specific findings based on data for why we're making certain decisions. So for example, it was raised earlier about, I think Chairman Derrickle had mentioned about the 47% of our population earns a lower income. I mean, that's a staggering number, but it's an important one relative to not just housing, but also to education. What can we do to increase people's potential? That will have impacts not just on housing, but on opportunities. So the information moving forward, I think we really need to be careful about how we present it. I know that there were some examples on the residential housing density that our consultant provided that all seem to be really more suited to corridors and large redevelopment of parcels. What I would suggest is I really think we need to have some examples of that missing middle. What do duplexes look like? Quads, triplexes, how do those integrate into the community? I lived in LA in the housing tract that was built in the 20s in an older part of town. And it was really just a great classic example of small single family homes nestled together with duplexes and triplexes, a perfect R1 neighborhood. And nobody really thought in terms of density at all, right? It was all about, you know, what your yard looked like, what your tree-lined street was like, whether you could walk on the sidewalk. Was it a small block? Can you connect to your neighborhood store? As Commissioner Toller had mentioned, you know, I think this is really ultimately about placemaking, and we need to really give a lot of thought to what that means. And as far as trying to communicate to the public in the future, you know, moving forward in this effort, we need those examples to show what does a duplex look like in an R1 neighborhood? What does that typology really in today's times look like? And then the third piece that I really wanted to touch on was about administering this housing program. And in particular, trying to figure out what are the right tools in our toolbox. What does the development community need? What does the planning department and economic development department need as far as processing applications? I mean, when I think of 12,000 units in 8 years, you know, that's unheard of on its face, but also, you know, how do we actually move those projects through our development pipeline? How do we process them? How do we provide expedited processing, as was suggested by some members of the public? Provide certain benefits in your project and you'll get another benefit in return. I'm intrigued by the idea of a 17th Street as a potential house home for housing. However, I'm not totally sold on the idea of an overlay as the tool to do it, especially if it's only potentially applied to, you know, a dozen sites. So to that end, I think we really do need to look at whether or not our overlays are effective, and if they're tools that are actually used by the development community, or they're just something that are sitting on the books and gathering dust. So I really, again, commend staff and our consultant team in putting together the materials where we are here. I really encourage everyone to look at the community profile and dig into that. There's some great information that I think should be kind of influencing and impacting not just our programs, but our development sites. And I don't want to forget too that, you know, one of the points that came out of that was showing an aging trend in our community. How are we planning for seniors? I think that's, again, a vital piece, and we need we certainly got input from the community on that in our district workshops, but I know that we need to really be thinking about that in terms of presenting material to the public. So those are all my comments this evening, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Chairman.
Vice Chair Colbert.
Thank you,
Good
Mr.
to go.
Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll try to be brief. A lot of the questions that I had have already been asked this evening. A lot of thoughtful input has come out of this. Shout out to Nick's team and for their outreach. I believe that when I participated in the March study session, our feedback community outreach piece, it was very great, and I'm just grateful for how it was very inclusive to all communities to ensure that we heard from everyone, which I think is reflected in that community profile summary. I wanted to piggyback primarily on a question that the mayor brought up earlier to Mr. Chen related to what our neighboring cities are doing. And so I guess one of the pieces that stood out to that same line stood out to me, but I wanted to ask an alternative question related to our neighboring cities. What are they doing to promote development? But also, is that something that fits Costa Mesa as part of our city profile and the types of housing that they are developing? Does that work for us? As opposed to just thinking about, we're being out developed, is that best for our city?
Yeah, I think that, thank you, Commissioner Colbert. I think there's a number of different responses that could go into that. And I think, in thinking more about the mayor's question, availability of land, certainly, it's difficult to compare cities, even if they are close to each other. It's difficult to compare a Costa Mesa and an Irvine when, Irvine has a major landowner in the Irvine company who has a plan set out and then has areas like the Great Park. So it's difficult to compare the development that's occurring there with Costa Mesa. I think there certainly are, examples of things happening in other cities that Costa Mesa could and is looking at currently. So I'd be hard pressed to pick out certain things that cities are doing really well. But I do know that I think we've talked about a number of things today relating to potential constraints that could be factors in that and what the mayor had identified. But short answer to your question is that I don't have a solid response for specific items that other cities are doing, especially surrounding cities, that would be a good fit. I think it's certainly something that staff and our team can look at, and to the extent that I know staff is talking with other cities, talking with planning departments in those cities to figure out what's going on, not only with the housing element, but with other planning processes that are going on. So as we continue those conversations, if items come forward that we believe would be good components to include in the housing element, I certainly think we'll bring that forward for discussion and consideration by council and planning commission.
Okay. And I think one of the, I guess, other key pieces listed in your constraints was a concern to me, and thinking about the infrastructure. And obviously when we think about infrastructure, we think about other city services that would be needed to accommodate over an 8-year period. And maybe this is a question to the city manager, I don't know. Are we thinking about, or how are we thinking about budgeting for the services of these needs of such a growth in our population, and what comes with that profile, specifically as we talk about affordable housing needs? I think there are a lot of equity concerns that may need to be addressed that our city may not be accounting for right now, in terms of language inclusivity, in terms of street signage, et cetera. And how all of those things just may promote a greater need for fire, police, water, trash, schools, all of those things. How are we thinking about that in terms of, as our community profile shifts from what it is and our population grows with budget challenges?
That's a great question, Vice Chair Colbert. I would say that as we go through this process, those are all things that we're going to consider. As you know, we're in a unique time just because of the fact that we're dealing with so many different challenges at once, not to mention the pandemic and the fiscal crisis that has ensued. I think as we go through the planning process for the housing element, and as we go through the visioning process in terms of specific sites and overlays, we'll also be looking at a multi-year fiscal forecast that we will be doing just as part of our normal budgeting process. It's a 5-year financial forecast where we would be looking at specifically the development that's coming online. That's part and parcel of working through our property tax projections. We would be looking at new development. And then as we do that, we would also be looking at the increased need for all kinds of services, whether they be police and fire services, even more of a demand for open space and other amenities, just the impact on quality of life issues and making sure that we could address those needs. And that would all be factored into that 5-year analysis, first in a sort of high level way, and then as individual developments come forward in a more detailed way. As you know, even with the One Metro West project that will be coming forward for council consideration, that was one of the things that we had looked at, was the increased demand potentially or impact on fire and police services. And so it's something that we absolutely have to consider as we move forward. 11,760 units is a big number. And so it's going to take some additional tools on our end and planning processes to make sure that nothing's missed and that we can incorporate all of the different metrics for ensuring that we have sufficient quality of life and that we're not, we're providing what we need to provide by way of social and public safety services across the board. So it's a challenge indeed, but part and parcel of the process that we'll have to go through to get the housing element going, and then our 5-year financial projections, and we'll build on that from there. But your point's well taken.
Okay, thank you for that response. And I think this is my last point, and I think this is a kind of responsive to the Balancing Act, and I think someone mentioned it earlier, related to the fact that this Costa Mesa shouldn't be a bedroom community, but in terms of thinking about how our zoning works, maybe it promotes that right now, but how do we build more live, work, play spaces and, more mixed use communities? But my question is, I think Commissioner Torje really brought up a really good point that I hadn't considered, and I live next to the airport district here in Baker Block. When she talked about air quality, I hear the planes a lot, but I hadn't really considered my air quality a lot. But I guess the question is, in thinking about how do we balance or attempt to balance the growth of residential with our business community, specifically as we think about rezoning some of our industrial areas? Is that something that the business community has weighed in on, or an analysis that we have factored into how, given, I think Chair Arco brought up the fact that maybe we don't have the best type of jobs in the community, then our employment rate, I think it wasn't high as other areas in Orange County, but was maybe high. But how are we attempting to balance this type of residential development and also maintain a healthy economic land use and areas and opportunities for industries to come into our city? I don't know who that would be directed.
I can go first, and then maybe pass off to Jennifer. So it's a great question, and it's always a difficult thing to consider. But it was part of the housing element sites analysis process to look at these different areas. We have plans in the process to contact property owners of sites that eventually get identified. We have not reached out to everyone. We have talked to a number of folks in terms of parcels being considered. And also, not considered some parcels because they do represent a large part of the city's tax base, and it's not realistic to think that they potentially could redevelop within the planning period. So we gave a lot of consideration to that. I think the process isn't perfect, and looking into the zoning and looking at how those districts and those areas and specific plans and overlays are established to maintain some of those non-residential uses in a fashion that still works and is still an actually developable and usable space is really key to creating successful places. So the fact that we're not just replacing, doing a one-for-one swap, residential for industrial or residential for office or commercial, whatever it may be, but that there's a component of mixed use in certain areas where it still makes sense to be able to maintain, as I think it was Chair D'Arco mentioned, some of those smaller incubator type spaces or uses to help promote smaller businesses. I think there's a lot of opportunity for that, but it will likely change some potential makeup of the community as things redevelop. Again, the kind of visioning and future-looking component of that is sort of yet to be established as part of the housing element process, and really continues as part of the programs.
Yeah, great. The only thing that I would add to that is that certainly part of looking at these housing opportunity corridors was really taking a look at the existing uses, but the rubber meets the road really on the balance of industrial and commercial uses versus residential as we move forward into the next phase. The city has a fiscal model that essentially projects how we're doing on the balance from a fiscal standpoint, but it's really more than that as well. If you're thinking about industrial sites tend to be sites that we gravitate to from a housing element perspective because they tend to be larger sites that have a little more potential to accommodate housing projects. But at the same time, those large sites are also the places where office headquarters tend to go, like Andrew. So we're balancing not only making sure that we are providing enough land for commercial services, resident serving services, but also that we're providing a balance of enough sites to accommodate job centers in our city. So that is definitely a part of the next phase of our analysis as we go through really starting to do corridor plans and specific placemaking policies here. Is really to strike the right balance and make sure that from a fiscal perspective, we have a good balance of commercial, industrial, so that we have a good employment base, as well as a tax base, as well as a residential community. And it's not an easy job. It's not an easy calculation at all.
Yeah, and thank you, Ms. Lee, for that response, and also Mr. Chen. And I'll kind of close with this, because living in Bacon Block, I feel like I've had a very unique experience in terms of thinking about how a residential community is in the middle of a primarily industrial or commercial area. And also it makes me, I guess, Commissioner Toller might love this, makes me more car dependent in terms of having to leave my community a bit. So I would recommend that when we are thinking about placing specific residential communities in these historically commercial areas or corridors, that we're thoughtful about the types of the needs and services around it. While I can get to the 55 and other places like Red Hill relatively quickly, or walk to Sobeka, I think that there are like sidewalks and other things that just may be necessary to function. We've kind of created that. We've kind of barged our way into this community, and it works because we work opposite of the commercial community that's adjacent to us in terms of traffic flow, et cetera. So we aren't competing, but I think it's important to kind of think about what potential conflicts could happen when you are integrating those two spaces. And I think that's important to think about with the mix of live, work, play. But I think there are some great models out there that we can pull from, and best practices that may make this work. Again, thanks for the thoughtfulness. Thanks for the work that's been put into this. I don't envy you, and I'm looking forward to what we come out with. So thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Mr. Mayor.
Yes, and so before I call on, give the floor to Council Member Reynolds, I did want to say, I should have said before, yes, welcome Commissioner Areth, and I'm very proud that to have nominated you, and thanks for your work today. And then also to let you all know, if you haven't figured it out, there will be no seconds. Okay, so you guys took your shot, and that's great. So now our final contributor, definitely not least, from District 5, Commissioner Arliss Reynolds.
Thank you. Just wanted to see, did you get the memo that Commissioner Zick gave me his time too?
Yeah, that's extremely funny. That's extremely.
I'm not going there. So we're avoiding.
All right, I'll try to be. I just want to start by saying I've just really enjoyed sitting back and listening to this conversation. I'm going through my day 2 of, or first day of vaccine shot number 2. So it's been a bit of a stressful and difficult day, but my cup has just been filled listening to this conversation. And I want to thank staff and our commissioners and council members and all of the members of the public who have contributed to what I recognize as a very, very new vision or different vision for housing in Costa Mesa, and one that I think is right on track for not just what is good for our city, but really what I think a lot of our community will embrace. So thanks to everyone. And want to make sure we include Mr. Chen on that list of young families we want to keep in Costa Mesa as well. So thanks for your work on this, Mr. Chen. I think I mostly want to cheerlead things that I've heard already. I might have a couple new things that I didn't get checked off my list. I wanted to be organized about this, but I'm just going to sort of go in order with my notes, and I'll try to follow a similar trajectory as Chair DeErkel did. Really high level first. We started off with a 1-2 bang with our first 2 speakers about a walkable city. I think there are so many reasons that's a really critical design. I talk about the safety components of that a lot, but a walkable city contributes to thriving city, a sustainable city, a city with a strong economy, a city with strong community resilience. There's just so many benefits. So when we get to the development standards phase, I think those are some really good standards to be looking at, and that's a really good part of our vision. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. I'm getting beeps. Uh-oh, I don't know what that is. Let me know. Oh, okay. Can you still hear me? All right, headphone was dying. Okay. I was looking up our mission for Costa Mesa that we developed this year, and I think that's a good part of the vision to keep in mind too. The city of Costa Mesa serves our residents, businesses, and visitors while promoting a safe, inclusive, and vibrant community. We've talked about wanting to support a diverse community. Commissioner Russell mentioned, and I think another mentioned supporting multi-generational communities, diversity in race, ethnicity, culture, in interests, activities, pastimes. I think those are all really nice kind of broader goals in shaping this plan. I want to cheerlead some of the comments we heard. We want to make sure that we're not displacing Costa Mesa families. We want affordability so families can thrive. And as Councilmember Harlan mentioned, I think maybe one of the pieces of data I'd like to see and wish we had a closer tab on was just the cost burden for families. I know like max 30% of income on rent or mortgages is the goal, and we are, I think, far from that for many families, which has many other negative effects. And I want to cheerlead multiple comments we've heard about, creating housing and creating communities so that Costa Mesans have opportunities to live without a car. Car ownership is really expensive for families, especially when everyone in your family needs to have a car. So I love those visions. Chair DeErkel, I didn't drool, but I had just written down places with a whole bunch of circles when you mentioned that. So thank you for bringing up the importance of places and placemaking principles. If others haven't heard of it, I encourage you to look up projects for public spaces and look at sort of the mix of ingredients that we want to have in sort of the same space to create really thriving community spaces. We talked about our aging population. There's principles around an age-friendly city. AARP has actually gotten really active in this with their sort of principles for livable cities. They're actually funding some work on this now too, or maybe they have been. A point I wanted to make when we're considering housing for our aging community is, I think especially with COVID and really distressing times, it's important to make sure that we are not isolating our seniors sort of in their own community. I think I'd really like to see us thinking about housing that helps keep seniors integrated in our community. I've done a lot of reading up on sort of blue zones and these principles of very healthy spaces, and that social interaction, especially for seniors, is a really important part of aging in good health. So anyways, I just wanted to bring that up. Councilmember Harlan, a couple study sessions ago, mentioned having these sort of broad guiding principles as well. And I just love almost everything I've heard about what we're trying to accomplish with this plan. So thank you. Open space. Land is scarce. Open space is important. We're at least 70 acres short right now on our reaching our goals for park access for our residents. That's only going to get tougher as we grow. And I want to keep in mind also when we talk about open space, it's not just parks, but also sort of community gathering spaces. So I want to make sure that we're thinking about how we're creating public spaces in general, where people can connect. These are sort of like the plazas we love to hang out in and people watch when we travel, and there's just not much of that, especially not much that's publicly accessible in Costa Mesa. And that's where community connections happen, right? That's where people meet people who aren't like them. That's where we run into our neighbors and like find out, hey, when we're not on Facebook, we actually really like each other a lot and have a lot in common. So I think it's really important to sort of build some of that public space infrastructure that's accessible and welcome for all. I loved the images you shared, Mr. Chen, about mixed use facilities. I've lived in a mixed use building before and I loved it. I was able to stop cooking mid-meal, run downstairs and get some groceries and finish cooking a meal. It might not be for everyone, but it's for a lot of people. And I think it really does contribute to sort of a vibrant, thriving community. I think some of our young professionals would love that kind of space. We mentioned 17th, 19th, Harbor, and Newport. I want to make sure that we're considering Placentia for that, all the way down to where Placentia turns into Newport and Superior as well. I think those locations are already starting to evolve a bit. They're really ripe for some of these mixed-use corridors. One thing I hadn't heard, well, I'll continue the cheerleading. So I like the conversation about the airport area. I want to make sure that we're not sort of dismissing that as an opportunity. When I was leaving Boston, there was quite a bit of development right around Logan Airport. I think a lot of it was catering to young professionals in the consulting business that were like gone most of the week anyways. So I would say if there's, if when we're talking to developers and there's a market for it, let them build and cater to that market. I wouldn't be against that, and I don't want to dismiss that. I won't expand. There's some really interesting housing concepts in the Boston area on that right now. One thing I didn't hear much of yet, but I want to make sure is really important, and that's that we talked about units, and my understanding is for the purpose of the housing element, a studio is the same as like a 3 or 4 bedroom home. And I don't know what our strategy is. Maybe I'll give you an opportunity to explain how do we make sure that we're incentivizing units or sort of creating opportunities to create units for families and not just a whole bunch of, studio apartments.
Yeah, so thank you, Councilmember Reynolds. There is an analysis in the community profile about large families. And so we do look at the community's composition regarding large families. I think to address really the heart of your question is, and we keep harkening back to the development standards, but looking at ranges and how you set unit sizes. Some communities have taken a look at setting, potentially a median unit size to where when you have some small units, you need to offset it with some larger units as well. Others have just set ranges for minimum unit size and max unit size. So I think a lot of that really drives the potential unit size in terms of bedrooms or just overall. I think that the density examples that we showed really showed how unit sizes can impact what a development looks like and how there really can be a wide range, whether it's rental or for sale. But in essence, a lot of that's going to be driven by the development standards and how those get implemented and what specific language gets put in to look at things like unit sizes and how it's measured. So when a developer comes in they know the metric they're being based off.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to make sure that we're creating that space. There might be sort of cultural differences too in the preferences that where people are living. Again, I think COVID highlighted for me how nice it was to be so close to my parents. And I think there's a lot of advantages to multi-generational living, also just supporting families in general. One comment on some of the specific plans we have in this discussion about zoning in industrial spaces. So I do have a little bit of a concern, and I want us to be really careful with the Mesa West Bluffs urban plan. This is the one that lays over our West Side industrial area. Chair DeArco mentioned that the arts are in North Costa Mesa, but I'd say that's where the fine arts are. I think like the garage arts and the action sports arts are over here in the West Side, and that's an industry that's really put Costa Mesa on the map as well. In my neighborhood, we've got a lot of the people who work in that area and some, world famous surfers and shapers, and I won't pretend to know that industry very well, but they're thriving now, and I would want to be careful that we don't displace them, and a lot of those local jobs that many of which have been here for a long time. So I want to make sure that we're careful with the industry over there. It's also an area where, because of that industry, we do have some air quality issues already too, so that's something to take into consideration. That's almost it. Two questions. One, in our programs, I didn't hear anything about hotel motel purchase programs. Mayor Pro Tem Mar, I don't see her. We were talking about one of the hotels along Newport Boulevard recently. I think there still is some opportunity there. So if that's a tool we can use, let's make sure we're including that, especially while I think the state has some, maybe some incentives or funding for that. I love ADUs and JADUs. I think we should use some of that funds. I think we already have it allocated to streamline that as much as possible and create real opportunities for existing homeowners to build really low impact housing in their neighborhoods. My neighborhood, again, the Freedom Homes and the Sunshine Homes, they're probably good neighborhoods to have what do you call it, sort of like existing pre-approved designs for ADUs to be built. And if we can lower those barriers to make that happen, I think more people would make that happen. I had a recent conversation with the folks at Habitat for Humanity, and they were interested in considering, working with homeowners on a program like that to improve access to affordable housing units. Almost there. There is a report that was released in the last week about sort of the state of ADUs in California, and it's really interesting to read. One of the things that stood out for me is that ADUs, they said ADUs, very few new ADUs provide housing for school-aged children or senior citizens. That may be obvious. It was 11% house children and only 15% house senior citizens. So I want to make sure we're not sort of leaning on those too much as a solution for those demographics. And then just the last comment on maybe going back to one of Commissioner Toller's early comments, and that's on this sort of incremental development, gentle density. I think we talk a lot, I hear that we talk a lot to large landowners and large developers. I want to make sure that we're also talking to small developers and understanding how we can make processes easier for them, cheaper for them to be building more of the incremental development like ADUs, JADUs, duplexes, and so on. Let's not forget about them. Those projects are much less controversial in general. But thank you for everyone's comments. I'm really, really excited about this conversation. That's it.
All right, thank you very much. And I don't expect anybody else has anything else to add. So why don't we adjourn, shall we? Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much. Good work.
Congratulations to the winners.
Good night, all.